Welcome back, guys. We are now at the tail end of looking at the end of communism, communism in Eastern Europe. And in our last video, we talked about how communism collapsed in Poland and then East Germany. Now we're going to focus on their neighbor, Czechoslovakia. And so Czechoslovakia was much like its other Eastern European communist peers in that it was led by conservative leaders who didn't want any type of change, who feared change, and even though protests are erupting in Poland and in East Germany, the leader of Czechoslovakia, name is Miloš Jakeš, decided that that's not going to change. We're not going to change who we are. We're going to continue being communist Czechoslovakia. On October 28th, 1989, this is right at the same time those protests are raging in Eastern German cities, thousands of protesters gathered in Prague, which is the capital city of Czechoslovakia, and they're there to protest a lot of things: their lack of freedom, the lack of prosperity, but especially the arrest of a prominent critic of the government. His name was Vaclav Havel, and Vaclav Havel was a famous playwright. And again, he had spoken out against the government, and now he's under arrest. And the people are pretty upset about that. Now, think about most dictatorships. When mass protests break out, there's usually one reaction: swift and violent, right? You're going to crush these protesters before the protests can spread. And so the police are called out. They start beating the demonstrators, arresting hundreds. It's the typical crackdown thing that they go for. Well, this crackdown actually backfires because the people of Czechoslovakia are like, no thank you. We are not going to sit around and let ourselves be beaten by the police. And by November 25th, 1989, about 500,000 protesters have gathered in downtown Prague. And they're there to demand that their government, the communist government of Czechoslovakia, step down. The sight of 500,000 people gathered together for one common cause, that's pretty intimidating, right? You can't stop them. And one of the things the crowd did, and I love this, is they jangled their keys as a sign of like telling the people to leave, right? To tell, this is the end of the communist government. You need to leave. And so they're shaking their keys at them to tell them to leave. This protest works. I mean, the sight of this massive crowd intimidated, I think, the communist government of Czechoslovakia, and they stepped down peacefully. And because this transfer of power was peaceful, it's known as the Velvet Revolution, right? No one had to die. It was nice and soft, if you will, like velvet. And so, like Poland, like East Germany, Czechoslovakia joins the club of countries in Eastern Europe giving up on communism and choosing democracy. And the first president of this free Czechoslovakia was the man whose arrest had sparked the protests in the first place, Vaclav Havel. You can see him here. There's Bill Clinton, our president in the early 1990s. Speaking of early 1990s, Czechoslovakia, of course, is not on the map any longer. And you're probably thinking, well, what happened to it? Well, Czechoslovakia itself was kind of an artificial country anyways, formed after World War I. It was made up of two distinct groups, the Czechs over here and the Slovaks, or Slovakians. And the two sides basically agreed to go their separate ways. Now, this is not a civil war situation. They basically just agreed to part ways peacefully, almost like a divorce. And that's why there are two countries today, the Czech Republic, also known as Czechia, and Slovakia. Yes, Czechia, that's a real thing. All right, our final country in Eastern Europe to give up on communism is Romania. You can see Romania right over here on the Black Sea next to the Soviet Union. And even though communism is collapsing everywhere around Romania, they look like they're the country that might be able to hold out against that tide. And the reason is they have a brutal dictator named Nicolae Ceausescu. And Ceausescu had been in power for many, many years. He had just run the country, much like, say, North Korea is run today, just, brutal tax on this people, lack of freedoms, economic misery. It was a pretty lousy place. A good example of Nicolae Ceausescu's leadership, if you want to call it that, this is known as the Palace of the Parliament. This was something that was begun under his leadership. It is the fourth biggest building on Earth today, and about 70% of it is empty. So this was a huge project, and it doesn't serve any other purpose other than basically saying, I'm the dictator, I want the biggest building ever, build me the biggest building. And so they did. For what, right? Most of it is empty today. So, December 1989, the Berlin Wall has already fallen, communism is collapsing all across Eastern Europe, and people are hearing about this in Romania. And in the Romanian city of Timisoara, people decide to take to the streets in protest. And this is when Ceausescu orders his soldiers to open fire on the demonstrators. Hundreds are killed or wounded in these attacks. And this is going to have a major ripple effect across Romania, because when Romanians hear that their government has used violent force to kill Romanian people who are just protesting, they've had enough. They've had enough. And they can see other countries in Eastern Europe protesting and giving up in communism, and they want to be the next country to do that. So an uprising erupts across Romania. Many army units that were told to shoot the protesters, in fact, join with the protesters, and you have this almost like little mini civil war breaking out in Romania. And you can see, bodies piling up here of the victims of the violence. And it's obvious Nicolae Ceausescu is losing control of his country. And the shock of the collapse of his power was real. And there's a famous moment where Ceausescu decides to have this big rally to try to build support back up, and he's standing on this balcony talking to this massive crowd, and he's assuming it's going to be like every other one of his speeches, where it just goes on forever and everyone cheers no matter what he says because they're brainwashed and all that, and they're afraid. And so he starts to talk, and the people start to protest and boo and yell at him. And the look on his face tells you the reality is sinking in, that I have lost power, and I got to get the heck out of here. And so he and his wife flee. However, they're captured. They're put on trial, a very short trial with a obviously predetermined verdict, led straight from the courtroom outside and executed on the spot. So both he and his wife were killed on Christmas Day, 1989. That is it for Nicolae Ceausescu. So by the time we get to Christmas 1989, communism is collapsing all across Eastern Europe. And this leaves really only one big communist country left, and that is the Soviet Union, which included all of this through here. And the story of the Soviet Union's collapse we'll cover in the next video.